Do want to talk a little bit further about everything that we know right now ahead of the jury visiting the Moselle residence site of the murders tomorrow morning. So for more on this, we want to go out live now to reporter Avery Wilks, who is with the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina. Avery, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. What are your thoughts on everything up to this point, hearing from those final witnesses in court today?
I kind of wonder the same question about the jury. They've been sitting through 5.5 weeks of this trial. They have heard so much material from, evidence surrounding the June 7th, 2021 murders, to Alex Murdaugh's opioid addiction, to his financial crimes, to the bizarre, September 2021 staged shooting / insurance fraud / assisted suicide scheme. I mean, we've just covered so much ground here. I'm very curious how much of that the jurors have retained. And I think that, the next 24 hours in this case are going to be by far the most important, because obviously the jurors are going out for their field trip to Moselle. But then after that, we are going to get into closing arguments. And the state is going to have a big job of bringing its case together, whittling it down into a coherent narrative that explains to the jurors how and why these slayings were committed, and doing that in a compelling way. Because one of the big criticisms of prosecutors in this case so far is that they've just presented a lot of numbers and data points and GPS locations and cell phone message timestamps, but they haven't really explained the relevance of a lot of that material. And so closing arguments, they are going to have to deliver, and they're going to have to remind the jurors of all the important things they've heard and why they're important. And I think that's a big job.
Yeah, and that property at Moselle, very large. I don't know if you've ever been there or maybe close to the area. What do you think that'll present to jurors? Do you think that's really going to be helpful? Because as you said, it is a lot for them to retain all of this information. I mean, even for us reporting on it, people who are just interested in the case, and then the jury hearing from so many people and all this information.
I think it will be helpful just to visualize it and to understand the scale of things. Because when you hear about a 1,700 acre piece of land, it's hard to fathom that, even if most of it is, woods and swamps and waterways and otherwise inaccessible areas. But they've heard a ton about the cabins and the processing shed and the dog kennels and this whole area of the crime scene where Maggie and Paul were killed. But it's hard to visualize that unless you can see it. We've seen maps and 3D renderings and crime scene footage and dash cam, but I think the defense in particular wants them to see that because they just want to see how big the place is, and how, if you're up at the main house where Alex claims he was at the time of the shootings, that's more than 400 yards away as the crow flies, and you may not necessarily hear gunshots or see what's going on down by the kennels, as the slayings are committed. So obviously, this is a field trip that the defense wanted the jurors to take, and it's one that prosecutors objected to and said that, this is a waste of time. This is, not worth it. So there's obviously some strategy going on there by the defense.
Well, and hearing from more than 70 witnesses, and also hearing from Alex Murdaugh himself taking the stand last week, what were your thoughts on that?
It was a really pivotal, I think, moment in this trial because, initially we weren't sure he would take the stand. In fact, we thought that he wouldn't. And the fact that he did take the stand is probably a sign of desperation by the defense. It's a sign that they thought the state had proven enough of the case that their client had things to explain. And I thought, he testified for 2 full days, and I thought on the first day he came off really well. He humanized himself. He showed emotion. He admitted his wrongdoing in the financial crimes. But and he provided this explanation of what he had done on the night of the slayings and why he had lied about his alibi and his whereabouts. But then on the second day, it all started to fall apart. And I thought that the prosecutor, Creighton Waters, really landed a lot of blows. and he was able to hammer home the idea over the course of that 2-day cross-examination that sorry, everything just went dark here. He was able
okay. We can still see
to
you.
hammer home over the course of that cross-examination that, Murdock was a sort of a sociopath, a liar, a master manipulator, con man, someone who would say anything he had to say in order to get what he wanted, whether it was stealing from his clients or misleading his family or his friends about his opioid addiction, or in this case, trying to get a not guilty verdict from the jury. So by the end of those 2 days on the stand, his credibility, or what remained of it, was basically eviscerated by the prosecution, as he had to repeat over and over again, I lied, I cheated, I misled people, I stole their money, I knew those things were wrong, and I did them anyway.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear him admit to all of that and lying repeatedly within really the first few minutes of him taking the stand. We also heard from other family members throughout the trial as well. Buster, John Marvin, and Maggie's sister. What are your thoughts on the other family members who also took the stand?
Buster was not very emotional. He's Alex's surviving son. He's not really known to be a very emotional guy, but he did help his father in a number of ways. He helped explain some of the behaviors and the actions that Murdock did in the aftermath of the shooting, that prosecutors had held up as suspicious or as evidence of wrongdoing. The fact that on the night of the slayings, Murdock parked in the back, behind his parents' house when he went to go visit his mom. Prosecutors sort of hinted that he did that in order to stash some of the murder weapons, and then later go back and retrieve them and dispose of them for good a few days after the slayings. But Buster, poked holes in that idea. He said that anytime you were visiting his grandparents' house, especially at night, you would park in the back so you could go in the back door. So it was things like that. I mean, he also said that his father was with him basically all day, every day for the 10 days after the killings, and that he never saw his dad sneak away to dispose of evidence or, do anything suspicious. So while Buster wasn't really helpful on the emotional front, he was helpful in some of the logical, fronts and trying to explain some of the things that were going on. And then, of course, his brother, John Marvin, was very folksy and endearing and personable before the jury, and he did provide some of that emotional detail. He talked about Alec and his wife Maggie as a couple and how they would hold hands and sway at a Darius Rucker concert they attended on a double date. He talked about Alec's relationship with his sons and how he would bring them on every hunt they went on, and just lived for those boys. So I think the family did help him in some respects, but the question is whether that emotional appeal is going to outweigh what prosecutors have presented and how tightly they've condensed the timeline between when Alec was at the crime scene with the two victims and when the shootings began just a few minutes later.
Right, and then in the midst of all of this, Netflix releases their series highlighting the Murdaugh family. Everything prior to this, really, the boat crash and all of the financial crimes that they were showing throughout that. I'm not sure how much of it you've seen, Avery, but just being in the community, what are your thoughts on everybody who was a part of that series and what has been said about the family?
Yeah, it's always interesting when one of these documentaries come out, because so many different outlets and so many different streaming platforms everyone has their own Murdaugh documentary at this point, basically, or they've got one in the works. There are a lot of book deals going around. There's a lot of money being made on this story, but and each one of these documentaries seems to have something that the others don't, and so from what I've seen from this documentary series, which I haven't seen all of it, they really got some exclusives with the survivors of the 2019 boat crash that really started the undoing of the Murdaugh legacy and started to lead to Alec Murdaugh's downfall. And so we were able to hear things that we had not heard before about Paul and his behavior and what actually happened on the night of the crash. So I found that fascinating. I'm looking forward to getting into the rest of it, but it has been interesting to see people kind of come in from that national perspective and tell this story of, drugs, deceit, and death and power and privilege here in South Carolina's Low Country.
Yeah, very interesting, and a lot of emotional stories that we're hearing from those survivors and everyone who's a part of that series. And speaking of different ways that people have been talking about the Murdaugh story, the Post and Courier has a podcast that I know you have a very big part in called Understand Murdaugh. Tell us a little bit about that and the things that you've uncovered while working on it.
Yeah, so we actually started the podcast last fall. We were a little late in the game on the podcast front, but at least we got it going, and we got it off the ground for a few months before this trial. But basically, we saw the podcast as a way to do what we already do in the print newspaper and on our website, postandcourier.com, which is to provide really in-depth context and analysis and deep dives into what the Murdaugh story is telling us about South Carolina, about problems and flaws within the legal system and the banking system and the criminal justice system, and power and privilege in rural South Carolina, and how it affects justice here. And so basically we started the podcast as a way to dive a little deeper into the things that we were already putting into print. We answer readers' questions, and we also have been putting out a daily podcast. It's about 10 or 14 minutes or so, somewhere in that range, every single day of the trial, which is fairly difficult to do, but because of just how fast-paced everything is moving. But it just gives our readers another medium to hear sort of our reporting and our analysis about this case. So we've enjoyed it.
Well, and just being there in South Carolina, seeing the community, what can you tell viewers about what this community has experienced before the trial and now during, the emotions? What all has that been like?
There's been a real buzz about the town of Walterboro as we've been here. This is now, I've lived in Walterboro almost longer than anywhere else at this point, because I've stayed here for about 6 weeks now. But I would say it really depends on which part of the 14th Circuit here in really southern South Carolina you're in. We've written a lot about the town of Hampton, which is where Murdaugh is from, and people there are really interested in disassociating themselves from the Murdaugh name and trying to get away from the stigma of everything Murdaugh, and how the Murdaugh family sort of lorded over that area for the better part of a century. But across the county border here in Colleton County in Walterboro, they seem a little bit more gung-ho about all this. People are interested in talking about it at bars. Everybody has an opinion on whether he's guilty or not, or whether the state is doing a good job of proving it or not. Everyone you talk to has different theories and things like that. And really, the town here has rolled out the red carpet for this trial. They've put media up in this in the wildlife center. So I'm working beside snakes and alligators and turtles all day, which is kind of interesting. They installed this really great Wi-Fi for us to use. They've set up food trucks in the parking lot for both us and locals. And, the local officials here have really just been awesome from start to finish. And they're not shying away from this at all. They're sort of embracing this, and they're trying to show, that they are, as they put it, they're the front porch of the Low Country. There's a lot of rocking chairs around town here. That's kind of their big tourism marketing push. So it's been kind of interesting how different types of people and in different areas here have either embraced or shunned this story.
Yeah, that is very interesting all around, and a lot of really great, insightful information. Thanks so much, Avery, for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm sure we'll talk again, and especially after the jurors are set to visit Moselle tomorrow morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me.